I was sitting in our home. I think it made slightly down. I was sitting in our home, and I've never told this full story before. Sitting in our home in Benmadigan Heights. If you can imagine it, in Belfast, the outside of Belfast, the cave hill there, and the home was built on the hill overlooking the Belfast Lough and overlooking too the shipyards way to the right where they built the Titanic. I was sitting there minding my own business and the phone rang. In those days there was no caller ID. I had no idea who was on the phone. I picked it up. It was my good friend Dan Beller from Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Pentecostal Holiness Church there. We had known each other for several years, and he said to me, "Leslie, I wonder on such and such a date, would you fly to Tulsa, you and Maureen?" He said, "We'll pay all the expenses." He said, "Because for that Sunday," he said, "I and a group are going to Israel." And he said, "We want you to take the morning and the evening service." And you know, while I'm on the phone, Maureen can hear half of it. And I'm saying, "Well, Dan, great to hear from you. And I'm going to pray about this." And Maureen's standing in front of me saying, "Say yes, say yes, say yes." And then she would tell me, "Now, while you're praying, I'm going to pack." But it wasn't too long until I told Dan that'd be lovely. It was in God's will. And I told our secretary, Joan, I said, "When you're booking our ticket, book it to Tulsa, Oklahoma, but bring it home through Orlando. It wouldn't cost any more, and it would give us a few days break at the Disney World area." That's how it came about. As innocent as that. So we did go to Tulsa. We did hold the two services. They looked after us wonderfully, lovely people. I've known Dan for over 40 years. And then we came to Orlando. And actually Kissimmee, right beside Disney World. I think it was the last day before we caught the plane back to Ireland. And we were driving on the 192 beside the Holiday Inn, and beside it there was this kind of a wooden kiosk. And it said tourist information. And we decided to go in there and pick up some brochures for Disney and SeaWorld, just to bring them home back to Ireland for the children to see them again. And we did that. We went in there. And I remember both of us went in and got a pile each, 3 or 4 or 5, came out, sat in the car. But in my pile, unknown to me, there was not only brochures about Disney World and all those things, but there was details of a real estate magazine. And so while Maureen was looking at her pile, I was going through this real estate magazine. No interest in it, really. We lived in Ireland. This is America. But I just was going through it, just killing time while Maureen is watching hers. And then I couldn't believe my eyes. They did church for sale. Now, I had no interest in a church in America. We didn't have a green card. We couldn't live here. It's impossible. But it's of interest, you know. I suppose if you're a barber and you go to Italy, you want to know how the barbers operate. I'm a preacher. It's interest, and that was all. And I happened to notice it was Ingram Street. I didn't know where Ingram Street was. I couldn't believe it when we pulled out onto the 192. In no time at all, I saw the street, Ingram Street. So I turned in, just out of sheer curiosity, not another thought in mind. When I pulled in there was one man working on the 2 buildings. A man apparently had bought these buildings from the Church of the Nazarene and was converting them into apartments. And so that carpenter was the only person there when we arrived. And we said, "Hi, we're just passing, preachers from Ireland. God bless you. See you." Now he said, "Let me show you here around." And he said, "I already have the Sunday school building completed. It's into 2 condos. And he said, "Tomorrow I start on the main sanctuary. I'm going to change it into condos." And we told him we were a preacher and background was a Nazarene. "What?" he said. He said, "The man that owns this," he said, "his daddy's a holiness preacher and he's just round the corner. He owns a store. I want you to hear this story." He said, "Please, please, please." He said, "Go by." He said, "He'd be tickled to meet you all the way from Ireland." Total strangers, total. And so we said, okay, and just round the corner, lovely store he had. We went in there, and just close to the opening was a desk. He was sitting at the desk. Maureen looked around. I shook his hand. We talked, and he said his father was a retired holiness preacher in North Carolina. And so we greeted each other, and he said, yeah, he had bought the church as a businessman for an investment, and he was selling it. And so we shook hands, said, nice to meet you. God bless you. I never thought I'd see that man in my life again. Never. So time's going on, and Maureen wanted to go to the Fashion Square Mall in Orlando, Highway 50. I'll never forget it. You know, sometimes Maureen's called Maureen, and sometimes she's called Maureen, because Ireland didn't have any malls, and Maureen loved them. And so we went there, and I was happy to go. I usually just sat around or walked around and had something to drink and look at a bookstore. Then it happened. Boy, did it ever happen. I couldn't believe it. Maureen's gone. She's looking at the stores. And it was as if the devil hit me with a ton of bricks multiplied by about 200. My whole being was, I can't describe it, as if I was in torment in my mind with mental battles. But it was worse than that, because in my body, I felt like the devil had reached inside me and pulled my nervous system out and destroyed it. I was sitting there. I said, what is wrong with me? And of course, I started to rebuke the devil and rebuke the devil and rebuke the devil. It was such a sudden attack in my mind and in my body especially regarding my nervous system. And I remember at one point walking out to our rented car, sat for a few minutes, came back in. That's about all I remember. Maureen told me at one point she came around the corner and saw me and knew that something was wrong and decided to go and have some more shopping. Nice piece of sympathy there, but anyway, that's what happened. And then finally, and you got to understand, finally, there was a lot of that. Maybe an hour, maybe an hour and a half, I don't know, but not a few minutes. And I'm getting worse and worse and worse as the time goes on. And I said, please, God, help me. Please, God, help me. And because I couldn't understand, didn't know what it meant. We had good meetings in Tulsa, a good little break in Florida. I mean, that's something from bombed out Belfast. And so I should have been feeling good, but I wasn't feeling good. And finally, something struck me. I said, Lord, if this is you, I said, Lord, you know that every time you speak to me, I always try to answer immediately. This time, I'm not answering because I don't know what you're saying. Now, friends, honestly, you got to believe this. The thought of that church and that man was nowhere in the picture, not within 1 billion miles. That little episode was over. And I said, Lord, now I'm asking, I wonder, is God doing this? But full of confusion relating to the situation, I said, Lord, when you speak to me, I always try to answer immediately, but I don't know what you're saying. And immediately, as clear as I'm speaking to you, this is what the Lord said back to me. Go buy, B-U-Y, purchase. Go buy that church. It's yours. And here we're in America, and we live in Ireland, and it sounded kind of crazy, but first thing I said, without thought of consequences or ramifications, first thing I said was, yes, Lord. And when I said yes, Lord, my nervous system was perfect, my mind was perfect, I was happy as free. It was as if a ton lifted off my mind. I was free. I'd heard from heaven, but I couldn't understand it. I rushed to get Maureen. And when I got her, I said, let's go, honey, let's go quickly. She said, what are we going to do? What's happening? I said, we're going to buy that church. She said, what? We're going to buy that church. We live in Ireland. And we drove back down to that man, hoping he'd still be there, went into his store, sitting there at the same desk, big burly fellow. In fact, recently, he told me he's going to visit us here one of these days. He lives up by Gatlinburg nowadays. But back then, he had this store. And so I walk in, and he looked up at me. He couldn't believe I was back because we thought that was it. Our little greeting was over. He looked up at me, and he started to cry. This big businessman started to cry. I said, sir, are you all right? Yes, he said, I am. He said, you don't know what it means to me for you to come back here. I said, what do you mean? He said, when you just went out that door, he said, I called my daddy, the retired holiness preacher in North Carolina, and told him about my little encounter with you and your wife. And he said, the both of us on the phone there were talking about you. And he said, my daddy said, don't you know, Steve? He said, that church is for the preacher. Don't let the carpenter start to tear the inside of the sanctuary and make condos. Stop it. He said, that's for that preacher. I said, what? Who said that? He said, my father. I said, well, that's why I'm back. I said, I'm supposed to buy this church. Wow, he said, isn't that fantastic? So he said, let's drive round to the church. This is a total stranger. So I drove round to the church. We all drove round there. And he said to the carpenter who was still there, he said, would you run round to the some paper store, I don't remember what it was, and get a legal form? And then we're looking at our watch because our planes. And the reason why God was dealing with me so mightily was because he didn't have much time. If he didn't get through to me quickly, I'd have been on the plane and home away to Belfast. So that's why the sudden shaking, which at first I mistook for the enemy. So the man came back and he started to fill it out. Total strangers. Total strangers. He filled it out, and then he looked at me and he said, the $64,000 question. He said, how much will you put down as a deposit? I wasn't quite expecting that. And so I whispered to Maureen, I said, how much have we got? And she said, $100. So I turned back. I said, $100, right? He said, I'll take it. There's no business sense to this at all. And so we took it, signed it, and shook each other's hands, drove off, went to the airport, got on the plane, and headed back to Ireland. And now we own a church in America, and the question is, what are we going to do about it? It sounded so crazy. In fact, at one point I said to my friend John Williamson, who's a friend of ours, got a church in Toronto, I told him what had happened. I said, do you think God may be leading you to Florida? No, he said, it's not me. He said, so I said, Lord, what are we going to do? And then the Lord showed me, over a period of many things happening, I'm going to move you to America. So, Maureen and I, and this is the bit that I want you to hear, but I had to tell you the lead up. Maureen and I and our 3 children, and at this time, I guess Ruth was about 16, Leslie 11, LaDonna 7. I told them all to get ready, Maureen and 3 children, we all get ready, and we go down to the center of Belfast to the American Embassy. Only it's not called the American Embassy, that's in London. As far as I remember, it's the American Consulate General. And you go in there, and the big question is, are they going to allow us to go to America? We didn't have green cards. And will we be on the 6-month list? Will we be on the 12-month list? Or would it be the 2-year list? Let me just say this, friends. If you want to come into America illegally, that's easy. But if you want to come in legally, that's not easy. A few years ago, when my 2 sisters were still in their 70s, I thought, wouldn't it be nice to have them live with us in America? And I contacted the American authorities, and they said, sure, we'll take their application. And they said, when it comes up on the list, we will go into it fully and let you know. I said, well, how long is the list before you'll start to consider it? Oh, they said the list is 12 years long. It won't even be looked at for 12 years. So I didn't know. But we have this church in America, and God's leading us to America, but we want to do it legally, and you can't get into America. So it seemed to be crazy. And we went down there, and we went in, and we sat, where the applicants sit, and then they call you, and it's to like little windows, like a teller window in a bank with a lot of protection and security. And the girl called us up when our turn came, and she said, you're applying for green cards, you want to go live in America? And I said, yes. And we had a thriving ministry in Ireland. There was nobody who didn't know us in Ireland. Nobody. Certainly in Northern Ireland. Thriving ministry. Thousands of people saved. That's the truth. And many healed too. But anyway, we're obeying God. And the girl said, well, I'm just looking through your papers and so forth. And then I remember she did this. Oh, she said, it's almost lunch hour. She said, would you mind, she said, going outside and getting yourselves a little lunch? Because she said, we closed down for an hour at lunch hour. And she said, we'll pick it up again. I think it was at 2 o'clock. I can't remember that, but I think so. And we said, of course. We couldn't do anything else anyway. But we said, we're happy to do that. We went out into downtown Belfast, went into a little restaurant, had a sandwich or something, and came back at, let's say it was 2 o'clock. And the situation is kind of hopeless. You bought a church, you bought it for $100. That man in America has to be paid. But you haven't a dog's chance of getting into America, certainly not for probably 12 months, maybe 18 months, maybe 2 years. And if you think about the 6 months list, that's a pipe dream. This is all factual, friend. This is what happened. So we had our lunch, we came back in this hopeless situation, and yet I knew I was obeying God. And we come back and we come in. Honey, you'll remember this well, and you too, LaDonna. And we walked in the door, and we were going to sit where the applicants sit, and then expecting the same girl to call us. And as we come into the door, into the general public area for the applicants, suddenly over here, a door opened wide. And you know, that takes your attention. We all looked over there, and there was a man standing in the doorway. He was the counsel himself, the general. He was the top man of the place. And he said, hey, and he pointed at me. Hey, come here. I didn't know what was happening. And I walked over into my office. He said, come on, into my office. And he was we called him the big cheese. And we walked into his office, Maureen and I, our 3 children. And he was behind the desk by this time. I always remember as I walked in, I saw 2 things that were so American. There was a big stars and stripes flag, and there was a big photograph of Ronald Reagan. And I remember those 2 things well. That's all I remember about the office. And when we walked in, he was at the other side of his desk, and he reached over the desk and did this. And I reached out my hand, and I was a bit perplexed, but I certainly reached out my hand and shook his, and here's what he said: welcome to the United States of America. I said, sir, what was that? He said, this is the top man. He said, welcome to the United States of America, and he shook all of our hands. I said, sir, this case was hopeless to us regarding timing. I said, sir, what does this mean? He said, here's what it means. Some way he had intervened without my knowledge. Here's what it means. He said, you can fly to America tonight if you can catch a plane, and you can live there because you've got all your papers and you've got all your green cards. So he said, I say it again, welcome to the United States of America.